Good evening, and welcome back to Drift Through History. Most of the stories we tell here move outward, across oceans, through campaigns, into the machinery of empires and the drama of their collapse. Tonight we're going to move inward. We're going to stay in one place, close to the fire, with the wind pressing at the walls, and we are going to talk about what it meant to live through a winter at the edge of the inhabitable world. This is not a story about raids. It is not a story about longships crossing the North Atlantic or warriors falling on foreign coasts. Those stories are real, and we will tell them another night. Tonight's story is the one that made those stories possible. The domestic story, the survival story, the story of what happened between October and April in the farmsteads and longhouses of Scandinavia, and Iceland and Greenland, and the other cold places where the Norse people built their civilization and sustained it across the centuries we call the Viking Age. The story of how they fed themselves, how they kept warm, how they understood the darkness, how they made meaning out of the most inhospitable season the natural world offers, and how they did all of this in a landscape that is, by any objective measure, one of the most demanding places human beings have ever chosen to call home. There is something specific and real about the kind of attention that winter demands of a people who depend on it. You cannot be casual about a winter that can kill you. You cannot defer its preparations or approximate its requirements. The knowledge that keeps a family alive from October to April, the knowledge of how much food to put up, how thick the walls need to be, how to read the weather, how to manage the animals through the dark months, how to maintain the fire through the night, is not the kind of knowledge that can be looked up when you need it. It has to be carried in the body, transmitted from generation to generation with the seriousness that the stakes required. The Norse people carried this knowledge with a care and a sophistication that their popular reputation, which tends to run toward the dramatic end of their history, systematically undervalues. Tonight we're going to try to restore some of what that undervaluation has cost. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is genuinely the kind of thing you come here for. And as always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights if you have not already. It is an appropriate gesture for what we are discussing. Let the room go soft. Let your breath slow down. There is a fire somewhere in this, metaphorically speaking, and we are going to sit beside it for a while. You have nowhere to be, and let us go north. The landscape that shaped the Norse winter experience was not a single landscape, but a range of them. From the fjord-cut mountains of Norway to the interior plateaus of Sweden, from the treeless volcanic plains of Iceland to the narrow coastal strips of Greenland, where the Norse settlers clung to the habitable edge of an island that was, by any standard except the one they had developed in Iceland, astonishingly hostile. But the common feature of all of these landscapes, the thing that they shared across their enormous geographic diversity, was latitude. The Norse homelands sit at latitudes that most of the world's population has never experienced, and would not choose to. Bergen, on the western coast of Norway, sits at roughly 60 degrees north, the same latitude as the southern tip of Greenland, the same latitude as Anchorage in Alaska, the same latitude as the northern coast of Labrador. Trondheim is at 63 degrees north. Tromsø, the largest city in northern Norway and a major centre of Norse settlement in the medieval period, sits at nearly 70 degrees north, well above the Arctic Circle, at the same latitude as the northern coast of Alaska. Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland, is at 64 degrees north. The Norse settlements in Greenland were at 61 to 65 degrees north. What latitude means in practical terms, at these levels, is this. At 60 degrees north, the winter solstice day has roughly 6 hours of daylight, most of it twilight rather than full sun, as the sun barely clears the horizon and sets again almost immediately. At 65 degrees, it is 5 hours. At 70 degrees, the sun does not rise at all for several weeks around the solstice. The polar night, Mørketid in Norwegian, the dark time, extends from late November to late January in the most northern settlements. Even in the more southerly parts of Norway and Sweden, The combination of short days, overcast skies common to the North Atlantic climate, and the low angle of the sun for the months on either side of the solstice means that the winter experience of a Norse farmer was an experience of near constant darkness, broken by a few hours of pale grey light in the middle of the day for 5 to 6 months of the year. This darkness was not abstract. It was physical, immediate, and omnipresent. The candles and oil lamps and open hearth fires that provided interior light in a Norse longhouse were sources of warmth and social focus as well as illumination, but they produced a quality of light that is difficult for people accustomed to electric illumination to properly imagine. Intimate, flickering, capable of creating a circle of visibility perhaps 2 or 3 meters across, beyond which the corners of even a modest building dissolved into shadow. The eyes adjusted over months to this dimmer world, and the Norse people developed an acute sensitivity to the small variations of natural light that those of us in brighter climates might not even register. The particular quality of light on a clear day after snowfall, the way the full moon on a clear winter night could produce enough reflected light off snow to make outdoor movement possible without a lantern, the gradual lengthening of the days after the solstice that would have been tracked with an attention born of genuine emotional investment in the return of the sun. The cold that accompanied the darkness was, depending on the location and the year, anywhere from uncomfortable to genuinely life-threatening. Winter temperatures in Norway average well below freezing across most of the country, with extreme cold events, nights of -20 or -30 Celsius, occurring regularly in the inland regions. Iceland's winters are moderated by the North Atlantic Ocean current and tend toward wet cold rather than extreme dry cold, but the combination of temperature, wind, and precipitation that the North Atlantic climate produces is its own category of unpleasantness, capable of killing exposed humans with a thoroughness and speed that the Norse settlers in Iceland learned to respect immediately. The Greenlandic settlements faced winters that combined genuine Arctic cold with a wind exposure that made even lower temperatures feel more extreme, and the Norse settlers there maintained themselves through conditions that modern observers, visiting the ruins of their farmsteads, find difficult to square with the sustained human occupation they represent. The snow that fell in these landscapes was not the inconvenience of a southern winter. It was a fundamental feature of the environment for months at a time, shaping movement, affecting agriculture, determining which domestic strategies were viable and which were not. In Norway's high valleys and mountain pastures, winter snowfall could be several meters deep, burying the landscape under a white weight that required the specific architectural and agricultural responses that Norse culture had developed across generations. In Iceland, the combination of volcanic terrain and subarctic climate produced a landscape in winter that was simultaneously beautiful and dangerous. The hot springs and geothermal areas that provided warmth and washing water and never froze, contrasting with the high interior ice cap and the coastal storms that could make outdoor movement impossible for days at a time. The longhouse was the foundation of Norse winter survival, and understanding it properly requires setting aside whatever image the word conjures: the dramatic Great Hall of Beowulf, the elaborately carved and decorated Mead Hall of popular imagination, and thinking instead about a building designed with ruthless practicality to solve a specific set of problems. How do you keep a family and their most valuable animals alive through a North Atlantic winter with the materials, the fuel, and the labour that a Norse farmstead could provide? The longhouse was the answer that Norse builders had developed over centuries of refinement, and it was an answer of considerable engineering sophistication, even if its sophistication was expressed in turf and wood and stone rather than in marble and glass. The typical Norse longhouse of the Viking Age was a long, narrow structure, typically between 15 and 30 metres in length and 5 to 7 metres wide, with walls that curved slightly inward at the base and tapered slightly inward toward the roof, giving the building its characteristic boat hull profile when seen in cross-section. This shape was not aesthetically motivated. It was structurally rational, The curving walls distributed the lateral thrust of the roof load more efficiently than straight walls of the same thickness, allowing the building to be larger and structurally more stable with less material. The walls themselves were constructed in various ways depending on local materials. In Norway and Sweden, where timber was readily available, the walls were typically of heavy planks or logs. In Iceland, where the forests had been substantially cleared within the first century of settlement and timber was scarce and expensive, the walls were of turf and stone, sometimes several metres thick, an insulating material of remarkable effectiveness that the Icelandic settlers developed into a construction tradition of considerable sophistication. The roof was typically thatched or turfed, again depending on local material availability, and carried on internal rows of wooden posts that divided the interior into a central nave and two side aisles. This central hearth ran along the length of the central nave, a long fire or series of fires whose heat rose to the roof and was only partially vented through a smoke hole or louver at the ridge. The imperfection of this ventilation, the smoke that did not escape, collected in the upper reaches of the building, creating a layer of warm, smoky air below the roof beams, was not an oversight. It was a deliberate design feature, because the warm, smoky air in the upper roof space served multiple functions. It preserved the food that was hung there to dry or smoke. It killed the insects and parasites that would otherwise have been a constant presence in a building occupied by humans and animals simultaneously, and it contributed to the overall thermal management of the interior by creating a warm layer that reduced heat loss through the roof. Long before we arrive at what the longhouse contained, it is worth understanding the specific animals that shared it, because the Norse relationship to their livestock was not the industrial detachment of a modern agricultural system, but a close, named, individually known relationship with animals that represented the family's wealth, that provided the traction and the dairy products and the wool, and the eventual meat that sustained the household, and that had to be managed through the winter with a degree of attention and expertise that we have largely lost the cultural memory of. The cattle were the most valuable animals on a Norse farm, representing a concentration of wealth that had no close equivalent in the portable assets of the household. A good milk cow in the Norse period was worth several times the value of a sheep, and comparable to the most valuable pieces of household equipment. The Norse cattle of the Viking Age were smaller than modern breeds, closer in size to the hardy, small-framed heritage breeds that have been preserved in some parts of Scandinavia than to the improved commercial cattle of the modern dairy industry, and they were adapted to the specific demands of the northern climate in ways that the breed selection of centuries of Norse farming had shaped. They were hardy. They were efficient converters of the poor hay that northern winters provided into milk and meat. They were not especially productive by modern standards, but their productivity was reliable in conditions that would have defeated modern high-output dairy breeds. The Norse farmer knew each cow individually, as a matter of course and of economic necessity. The cow that was a good milker, the cow that was difficult to breed, the cow that was gentle with the calves. These individual qualities were the detailed knowledge base on which the farm's cattle management depended. The Norse gave their cows names, which is attested both in the sagas and in the runic inscriptions that sometimes recorded significant animals alongside significant humans. The loss of a good cow to disease or accident was a genuine economic crisis, and the Norse response to cattle illness, the combination of herbal treatments and the specific nursing care that close daily contact with the animals allowed, was a body of veterinary knowledge applied by the same women who managed the household's human medical needs. The sheep were the most numerous domestic animals of the Norse world, and in Iceland and the other North Atlantic islands, they were arguably more economically important than the cattle, because they were more resistant to the specific challenges of those environments and could subsist on poorer pasture. The Icelandic sheep breed, which has been maintained in essentially the form that the Norse settlers brought from Norway in the 9th century, with relatively little subsequent crossbreeding, is one of the oldest domestic sheep breeds in the world and one of the most comprehensively studied by animal geneticists interested in the relationship between heritage breeds and the environments that shaped them. The sheep's dual function as both a wool producer and a meat animal made it the most versatile livestock in the Norse agricultural system, and the autumn lamb slaughter and the spring shearing were the two great sheep-centred events of the agricultural year, each representing a different kind of productive extraction from the same animal. The horse occupied a position in Norse culture that was neither purely utilitarian nor purely symbolic, but somewhere between the two in ways that made it unique among the domestic animals. Norse horses were small. The Icelandic horse, another breed maintained in essentially its Viking Age form, stands between 13 and 14 hands high, which makes it technically a pony by modern equestrian definitions, though in Iceland the word for pony is considered mildly offensive, and the animals are always called horses. They were used for transport and for farm work, but their role in Norse culture went beyond the practical. They were associated with the gods. Odin's horse Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse that could carry its rider between the worlds, was the most magical animal in the Norse mythology. They were used in ritual, including horse fights that were organised as festive and legally significant events at the Thing assemblies. And they were eaten, a practice that the Christian missionaries who came to Scandinavia in the 9th and 10th centuries found troubling enough to specifically prohibit, because horseflesh had pagan ritual associations that the church wished to sever from Norse dietary practice. The animals were inside. This is perhaps the most startling feature of the Norse longhouse to modern sensibilities, and it was not a cultural choice made for reasons of sentiment or convenience. It was the specific solution to the problem of keeping valuable livestock alive through a North Atlantic winter. The cattle and sheep and goats and horses that represented a Norse family's primary wealth, both as working animals and as the source of the meat and dairy products that supplemented the stored grain and fish, could not survive unhoused through the worst of the Norwegian or Icelandic winter. They needed shelter, and the shelter they were given was not a separate barn but a connected section of the same longhouse that the family inhabited, typically at the lower end of the building where a slight slope in the floor allowed drainage. The animals lived in their byre at one end, the family in their hall at the other, and between them a shared warmth that the animals' body heat contributed to in ways that the Norse builders understood perfectly well. A longhouse with 20 cattle produced a non-trivial amount of metabolic heat, enough to make a measurable difference to the interior temperature on a cold night, and the Norse architectural tradition placed the animals and the people under the same roof specifically to take advantage of this. The interior of a well-maintained Norse longhouse in winter was, by the standards of warmth and light available in the period, not a bad place to be. The central fire provided heat and light, and the social focus around which the household organised its indoor life. The sleeping benches that lined the walls, wide platforms of earth or wood covered with animal skins and blankets, where people slept in their day clothes under layers of covering, provided resting places that were warmer than any modern observer might expect, because the longhouse's thermal inertia, the heat stored in the thick walls and the soil of the floor, meant that even if the fire was allowed to die down overnight, the interior remained significantly warmer than the outside temperature. The smell was rich, smoke and animals and the fermented foods that were the staple of the winter diet, and the unwashed bodies of people and their livestock sharing the same enclosed space, and by modern standards unpleasant in ways that the Norse inhabitants had grown up with and did not register as unpleasant, having no experience of the alternative. The preparation for winter was not an activity that began in autumn. It was a year-round project in which every season contributed its specific tasks to the accumulated store that winter survival required. The Norse agricultural year was organised around a logic that modern farming, with its industrial supply chains and refrigerated storage, has largely abandoned. The logic of the hungry gap, the period in late winter and early spring when the previous year's stores were running low and the new year's production had not yet begun, and when the margin between sufficiency and starvation was measured in the careful accounting of every smoked fish and every barrel of whey and every bundle of dried grass. The summer months were when the animals went to the mountain pastures, the Sita system in Norway, which moved cattle, sheep and goats up to the high-altitude summer grazing, while the valley meadows below were cut for hay. This summer, separation of animals from the home farm served multiple purposes simultaneously. It allowed the valley's grass to grow undisturbed for the hay harvest, while the animals grazed the high pastures. It prevented overgrazing of the limited valley land, and it produced dairy products, butter, cheese, soured milk, in the quantities that the richer summer pasture allowed. The women and young people who accompanied the animals to the sæter were not on vacation. They were doing some of the most economically critical work of the entire year, converting the abundant summer grass into storable, concentrated food value that would survive the winter in forms the hay could not. A summer's production of hard cheese and clarified butter, packed into wooden tubs and sealed against the air, was a significant contribution to the winter's food supply and represented weeks of skilled labour. The hay harvest was the central drama of the agricultural year, the operation on which everything else depended, and the Norse understanding of what the hay harvest required was encoded in proverb, in law, and in the social organisation of rural communities in ways that indicate how clearly and how seriously its importance was understood. Norwegian medieval law codes specified the obligations of neighbours to assist each other with the hay harvest, in terms that reflect the understanding that a single family could not always harvest fast enough to beat the weather, and that the community's collective interest in ensuring that every farm had adequate winter fodder was strong enough to create legal obligations of mutual assistance. Bad weather during the hay harvest, prolonged rain that prevented curing, early snow that caught the grass still standing, was not merely an agricultural inconvenience, but a potential catastrophe whose consequences would play out across the following winter in the condition of the animals and ultimately in the survival of the family that depended on them. The hay that was cut and dried and stored was not merely feed for the animals, it was also thatch and bedding and insulation, and the Norse farmer who calculated how much hay to cut was calculating across all of these uses simultaneously, against the uncertainty of how severe the coming winter would be, and how early the spring pasture would be available. Too little hay and the cattle would begin to starve in February, their bodies consuming themselves for energy, their milk production falling, their strength for the spring ploughing depleted. Too much hay cut meant less grass available for summer grazing the following year, and the optimization of the balance between these competing demands required the kind of deep practical knowledge that only years of direct experience in a specific location could provide. The Norse farmer who had worked the same valley for 20 years knew its microclimate in ways that no outsider could replicate, which slopes held snow longest in spring, which fields flooded in wet years, which wines brought the weather change that presaged the hard frost. The fishing that supplemented the Norse agricultural economy was also heavily concentrated in the summer and autumn months, though the specific patterns varied enormously by location. The Norwegian coast offered seasonal herring runs and cod fisheries that provided protein in enormous quantities when the timing and conditions were right, and the technologies of preservation that the Norse applied to their fish catches, drying on wooden racks in the coastal wind, salt curing in barrels, fermenting in brine, produced storable products that lasted through the winter and that formed one of the most important elements of the Norse diet through the cold months. The dried stockfish of Norway, air-dried cod hung on outdoor racks until the moisture content dropped low enough to prevent bacterial decomposition, was one of the most important foods of the Norse world and one of the earliest Norse export commodities, valued across northern Europe as a portable, long-lasting protein source of high quality. The process of making it, the timing of the catch, the preparation of the fish, the management of the drying racks through weeks of variable weather, was a skilled operation whose success or failure had real consequences for the winter to come. The autumn slaughter was the most violent and most important single event in the Norse agricultural calendar, and it was called blot in Old Norse, a word that carried religious as well as agricultural meanings, because the killing of animals for the winter store was not, in the Norse world, separable from the spiritual accounting that the season required. The timing of the slaughter was calculated against the hay supply and the number of animals the farm could reliably feed through the winter. Every animal that could not be supported through to spring had to be killed before winter, because an animal that died of starvation in February produced less food than one killed cleanly in October, and was a waste of the hay it had consumed in the interval. the calculation of which animals to keep, the breeding stock and the best working animals maintained through the winter at the cost of the hay harvest to produce the next year's increase, and which to kill was the farm manager's most important annual decision, and getting it wrong in either direction had consequences that the family would live with for years. The meat from the autumn slaughter was preserved by every method the Norse had available, smoking over the longhouse fire, salt curing in barrels, drying in the cold autumn air, burying in bogs or snowbanks where the low temperature prevented decay. In the coldest regions, particularly in Iceland and Greenland, the natural refrigeration of the winter cold itself was a preservation tool. Meat buried in the permafrost or stored in outdoor stone structures in the most northern settlements could be kept frozen through the winter and remain edible when thawed in spring. The specific techniques varied by region and by the specific animal, and the Norse housewife's knowledge of these techniques, which fish preserved best by which method, how long smoked meat would last, how to tell when fermented foods had gone bad rather than merely pungent, was a body of practical food science that represented the accumulated experience of generations. The food that sustained Norse families through the winter was not, in its variety, anything like the diet of modern Scandinavians or even of Norse farmers in the warmer and more productive summer months. Winter was the time of the stored and the preserved, the monotonous and the concentrated, the foods whose virtues were durability rather than palatability. The grain, rye and barley principally, wheat only in the most productive southern regions, that had been harvested in late summer and ground into flour provided the base of most winter meals in the form of flatbread and porridge. The porridge was cooked in iron or soapstone pots over the central fire, a slow process that extracted maximum nutrition from the grain and that warmed the cook and the immediate vicinity simultaneously. It was plain food, filling food, food that the Norse ate without particular pleasure and without any evident sense that variety was a dietary right. It was what kept them alive. The dairy products that the summer's production had concentrated into storable forms, the hard cheeses, the butter stored under brine or in earthenware crocks, the skyr that Iceland developed into one of the most concentrated protein-dense fermented milk products in the human food tradition, were eaten alongside the grain in combinations that provided adequate nutrition for the hard physical work of winter life, even when they provided nothing that a modern nutritionist would describe as balanced or appealing. The Norse relationship to food was fundamentally practical, in a way that people whose food security is guaranteed by supermarkets and supply chains cannot quite inhabit imaginatively. Food was not a pleasure first and a necessity second. It was survival, and the organisation of the household's food supply was one of the most important responsibilities of the people who managed it. The fermented foods deserve particular attention, because fermentation was not merely a preservation technique in the Norse world, but a culinary tradition of considerable sophistication that was adapted to the specific demands and opportunities of the northern environment. The lacto-fermented dairy products, skyr, soured milk in its various forms, the sour butter that was sometimes preserved by burial in peat bogs and that could last for years in the anaerobic, acidic environment of the bog, provided not only protein and fat but the probiotic microorganisms that have become a modern health food category and that the Norse intestinal microbiome was apparently very well adapted to. The fermented fish products, hakal in Iceland, the fermented Greenlandic shark that is arguably the most extreme expression of Norse fermentation culture, edible only after months of burial and drying that neutralises the toxic urea in the fresh shark's flesh, were not primarily delicacies but practical solutions to the problem of preserving a protein source in an environment where other preservation methods were inadequate. The Norse housewife and the management of the household food supply was, in the Norse social structure, specifically women's work, carried by the woman of the household with an authority and a practical expertise that the culture recognised with the formal symbol of the key she wore at her belt, indicating her control over the stores and the storerooms, carried in her head a continuous accounting of the winter supply that would occupy a large fraction of a modern computer's processing capacity if expressed in explicit terms. How many barrels of dried fish remained? How much skyr? How much butter? How many wheels of cheese? How much grain in the storage pit? How much hay in the barn? How many weeks until the spring grass would be available for the animals? The gap between what remained and what would be needed, and the adjustments to daily consumption that closing that gap required, were the constant calculation of a winter's domestic management, and the women who managed Norse households were doing it continuously, against a background of physical labour that modern observers find difficult to comprehend. The ale that was brewed in Norse households from barley, and sometimes from herbs and wild plants, was not purely recreational, though recreation was part of its purpose. It was a caloric supplement, a source of B vitamins that the winter diet of dried meat and grain was otherwise short on, a way of using grain that had not stored well enough to be reliably milled into flour, and a social lubricant of genuine importance to communities confined to close quarters for months at a time. The Norse drank their ale from wooden bowls, and from the carved wooden cups that were among the most personal objects in any household, and the brewing of ale was, like the management of the food stores, women's work. The alewife of the Norse household was a figure of specific and recognised expertise, whose product was central to the household's social and physical functioning. The herbs that supplemented the Norse winter diet, dried and stored from the summer's gathering, used to flavour and preserve the monotonous staples of the cold months, were another component of the housewife's knowledge base that operated at the intersection of culinary skill and medical practice. The Norse did not make a clean distinction between food and medicine in the way that modern pharmacological culture has trained us to do. The plants that were added to preserved meats to improve their flavour were often the same plants that were used medicinally, and the body of knowledge about what plants did what, which herbs prevented meat from rotting, which eased the chest congestion that was a constant hazard in smoke-filled winter longhouses, which teas settled the stomach disorders that fermented foods occasionally produced, was a unified body of practical knowledge carried primarily by women and transmitted through observation and practice rather than through written texts. The nights were long and the Norse filled them. This is perhaps the most culturally significant fact about the Norse winter, and the one whose consequences most dramatically exceed what a simple account of survival might suggest. A community of people who spend 5 months of the year confined to the interior of a longhouse for 15, 16, 17 hours a day out of every 24 has an enormous amount of time that needs to be organised and occupied, and the ways in which the Norse chose to organise and occupy that time were not trivial. They were the activities through which the culture transmitted itself, through which social bonds were formed and maintained, through which the intellectual and spiritual life of the community was sustained. Before we describe what the long nights produced, it is worth being specific about who was in the longhouse, who the community of the winter fire actually consisted of, because the Norse household was not a nuclear family in the modern sense, but a more complex social organism whose internal hierarchy shaped everything about how winter life was organised and experienced. The Norse social structure divided free people into 3 main ranks: the Jarl class of leading men and their families, the Carls, who were the free farming class that formed the backbone of Norse society, and at the bottom of the free population, the Thralar, the thralls, the enslaved people whose labour was integral to the functioning of the Norse economy, and whose existence is one of the aspects of the Viking Age that the modern popular fascination with Norse culture tends to underemphasise. Slavery was not a peripheral feature of the Norse world, it was central to it. The raiding that the Viking Age is famous for was primarily a raiding for people, the capture of slaves from Ireland, England, Scotland and the Frankish coast, who were brought back to Scandinavia as property, and who constituted a significant fraction of the labour force on Norse farms. The estimate of thralls as a proportion of the Norse population at the height of the Viking Age varies by scholar, but some put it as high as 30% in certain regions. The thralls who lived in the Norse longhouse through the winter were there because they were property. Their labour belonged to the household that owned them. Their warmth was provided by the same fire that warmed their owners. Their food came from the same stores that fed the family, in quantities and qualities that the social hierarchy prescribed. They slept in the same longhouse, but in the positions that their status assigned. The lower end near the animals, the less comfortable sleeping arrangements, the coarser food. The sagas occasionally describe thralls with individual personalities and names, and sometimes with a dignity that the genre acknowledges even when the social structure would have denied it. But the general treatment in the sources of thralls as a class reflects a social reality in which they were considered a different category of being from free people, with different legal standing and different claim on the protection and consideration that the community offered. The free-farming families of the carls were the typical occupants of the kind of longhouse we have been describing, and their household structure typically included multiple generations: grandparents, parents, children, perhaps unmarried siblings or cousins, the thralls who worked the farm. The authority structure within this household was organised around the householder. The bondi, the farmer, whose legal and social standing depended on his ownership of the farm and his ability to maintain it productively. And his wife, the husfreyja, the housewoman, whose domain was the interior management of the household, and whose authority within that domain was, by the standards of the medieval world, remarkably substantial. The primary long night activity was textile work. The Norse textile tradition, the production of wool cloth from the raw fleece of the sheep that had been sheared in late summer, through the connected processes of washing, carding, spinning and weaving that converted raw fibre into wearable fabric, was one of the most labour-intensive and economically important activities of the Norse world, and it was almost entirely carried out in winter, by the light of the central fire, by the women and girls of the household. The wool that was not immediately needed for household use was one of the primary commodities through which Norse farms participated in the wider economy. Surplus cloth was traded at the seasonal markets that were among the most important social events of the Norse year, used to pay rents and obligations, and in Iceland specifically formed the basis of the standardised unit of value, vadmal, the homespun cloth that served as a de facto currency in a society that had little access to coin. The winter nights produced this wealth, spindle by spindle and loom by loom, in the firelit interiors of longhouses across Scandinavia and the North Atlantic. The men were not idle during the long nights, though the sexual division of labour in Norse culture was more thoroughly enforced in the domestic sphere than in some other aspects of Norse life. The repair of tools and equipment, the sharpening of blades, the mending of harness, the maintenance of the wooden and iron equipment that the farm's operation required, was men's work in the Norse household. The carving of wood and bone that Norse craftsmen practised with considerable skill, the decorative objects and practical tools, and the shipbuilding and architectural woodworking that characterised Norse material culture, was winter work in significant part. The long indoor hours given to the skilled manipulation of materials that summer's outdoor demands left no time for. The sagas tell of men sitting by the fire and carving, of households where the men's work and the women's work proceeded simultaneously in the same space, the firelight catching the blade of a carving knife and the gleam of a spindle whirl in the same moment, in the same room, while outside the North Atlantic winter pressed its cold weight against the walls. The storytelling was the heart of the winter's long nights. But storytelling in the Norse sense encompassed a range of practices that the single word does not adequately capture, and the specific forms of the Norse oral tradition deserve more careful attention than the general category allows. The sagas, the prose narratives that began to be written down in Iceland in the 12th and 13th centuries, and that preserve what the Norse oral tradition had developed over the preceding 2 or 3 centuries, are the most extensive surviving expression of that tradition, and their specific character reflects the conditions of their composition and transmission. They are stories of specific people, in specific places at specific times, told with a density of detail and an attention to individual psychology that distinguishes them sharply from the more schematic, heroic narratives of other medieval traditions. The saga of Njal's saga, the longest and most complex of the Icelandic family sagas, covers several generations of Icelandic history, involving dozens of named characters, following threads of dispute and alliance and marriage and feud across 50 years of the settlement period, and doing so with a narrative intelligence and a psychological penetration that has led modern scholars to describe it as the first great novel in European literary history, a claim whose relationship to what constitutes a novel can be debated, but that captures something real about the quality of the work. The saga's specific narrative mode, the flat, precise, slightly ironic prose that recounts acts of extreme violence and complex emotion with equal economy, the dialogue that is spare and pointed and carries weight beyond what the literal words say, the characterization that works through action and speech rather than through authorial description of interior states, is a mode that the oral performance tradition had developed in response to specific conditions. An audience who already knows the basic outlines of a story, and who is hearing it performed by a skilled narrator, needs different things from the narrative than an audience encountering it for the first time through silent reading. The saga's economy of description and density of implication were tools for keeping an audience engaged and for rewarding the knowledge they brought to the performance, and the winter longhouse was the environment that had produced and that best served these tools. The skaldic tradition was the other pole of the Norse oral literary culture, where saga was prose, episodic, and in some ways popular. Skaldic verse was poetry, formal, technically demanding, and aristocratic in its primary context. The skald who composed a memorial poem for a king or jarl, a drapa with its strophes and its refrain, and its system of kennings that required the audience to decode the layered referential complexities of the poetic language, was demonstrating a mastery of a technical tradition that had no equivalent in the simplicity that folk poetry or narrative prose allowed. The kenning system that is the most distinctive feature of skaldic verse, the compound poetic expression in which, for example, the sea becomes the whale road, or the sword, the wound snake, or gold, the fire of the sea, was a system that required both the poet and the audience to share an extensive knowledge of Norse mythology and heroic legend, because the kennings drew on that mythology for their referential content and could not be decoded without it. The kenning was, in its operation, a form of intellectual play that the winter nights were designed for, the pleasure of recognizing the reference, of tracing the connection between the poetic expression and the mythological or natural world it was pointing to, of appreciating the specific elegance of a poet's choice of one kenning over another for the same thing. The Norse audience for skaldic verse was an audience trained by years of winter listening to recognise and appreciate these complexities, and the skald who performed for them was in dialogue with that trained appreciation in ways that the performance made visible in the response, the nods of recognition, the appreciation of a particularly apt kenning, the memory of other treatments of the same mythological material that the new poem was implicitly in conversation with. The storytelling was the heart of the winter's long nights. The Norse oral tradition, the body of poetry, legend, myth, history, and legal knowledge that was carried in the memory of the culture and transmitted through performance, was not a peripheral entertainment but the primary medium through which the Norse understood their world, maintained their history, conducted their religious life, and educated their children. The skalds, the professional poets whose art was one of the most technically demanding literary forms in the European Middle Ages, with its elaborate system of kennings, its intricate patterns of alliteration and internal rhyme, its tight formal structures that required years of training to master, were at the apex of this tradition, composing elaborate memorial poems for kings and heroes, and reciting them at court. But the tradition ran below the skalds to encompass the entire community, and the winter nights were the time when it was most actively sustained. The Eddic poems, the mythological and heroic poems that were eventually written down in Iceland in the 13th century, and that preserve what we know of the Norse mythological tradition, were composed for oral performance in settings that the Longhouse Winter provides the most natural context for. The Völuspá, the great poem in which a Völva, a Cirrus, tells the history of the world from its creation to its destruction at Ragnarök and eventual renewal, was designed to be heard in a specific atmospheric environment, the dark and the cold pressing in around the edges of a firelit interior, while a skilled performer gave voice to the cosmos's largest narrative. The Havamal, the poem of wisdom attributed to Odin and containing the most systematic expression of Norse practical ethics, was designed to be transmitted in exactly the same setting. The fire, the winter night, the audience who knew most of it and was hearing it again, the performer finding in the familiar words the specific emphasis and the specific emotional register that the moment called for. The children who sat in the longhouse through the winter nights were being educated as they listened, absorbing the stories and the values and the practical knowledge that the culture needed to transmit to the next generation. The Norse were not a literate culture in the early part of the Viking Age. The runic alphabet existed but was used primarily for short inscriptions rather than for extended texts, and the transmission of everything that mattered happened through speaking and listening. The legal knowledge that allowed disputes to be resolved at the Thing, the assembly where Norse communities conducted their collective governance, was transmitted orally. The genealogical knowledge that determined kinship obligations and inheritance rights was transmitted orally. The navigational knowledge that allowed Norse sailors to cross the North Atlantic, the recognition of birds and currents and cloud formations and the colour of the sea that indicated proximity to land, was transmitted orally. All of it happened to a significant degree in the winter longhouse, around the fire, during the long dark months when there was time and there was nowhere else to be. The Norse relationship to the winter's darkness was not purely practical. It was also spiritual, and the two dimensions were not neatly separable in a world where the natural and the supernatural operated on the same plane, and where the powers that governed the weather and the harvest and the outcome of human affairs were not abstract theological propositions, but living forces that required active management through ritual, prayer, and sacrifice. The Norse religious tradition that the sagas and the Eddas preserve was a religion of the specific and the immediate, not a universalist theology of abstract divinity, but a dense, local, practically oriented relationship with a large number of specific powers whose cooperation was essential and whose displeasure was dangerous. The winter solstice was the most important single moment in the Norse religious calendar, and the midwinter feast, called Yule, or Jol in Old Norse, was the largest and most significant of the year's ritual occasions. The timing was not coincidental. This solstice was the moment when the sun had descended to its lowest point and would begin its return, when the darkness had reached its maximum and the days would begin, almost imperceptibly at first, to lengthen again. For people who lived with the psychological weight of the polar winter, the solstice was not merely an astronomical event but a genuine crisis point, the moment when the cosmic balance between dark and light was at its most precarious, and when human ritual action was most urgently required to ensure that the balance would tip back toward the light. The Yule feast was the mechanism of that ritual action, the sacrifice, the feasting, the drinking of consecrated ale, the specific invocations of the gods who governed the agricultural cycle and the cosmic order, performed at the moment of maximum need to secure the cooperation of the powers that made the world livable. The specific practices of the Yule celebration varied across the Norse world and across the several centuries of the Viking Age, and the sources that describe them, primarily the Icelandic sagas and the accounts of early medieval Scandinavian Christianity, that describe the pagan practices it was trying to replace, are not always consistent or reliable in their specific details. But the broad outlines are clear. Feasting on the preserved foods of the autumn, drinking ale in quantities that the social codes of the feast prescribed and that served both practical and ritual functions, making sacrifices of the animals whose blood and flesh were offered to the gods in exchange for the favourable conditions that the community needed for the coming year. The toast that was drunk at the Yule feast, to Odin for victory, to Njord and Freya for good harvests and peace, was not merely social. It was contractual, a renewal of the relationship between the human community and the divine powers on whom everything depended. The wild hunt, The Norse tradition of Odin riding through the winter sky at the head of a host of the dead, accompanied by dogs and ravens and the spirits of those who had died in battle, was the mythological expression of the specific quality of the winter nights, when the wind in the roof of the longhouse and the sound of the storm outside provided the sonic equivalent of what the mythology was describing. The Norse heard the wild hunt in the winter wind, and whether this was literal belief or metaphorical understanding or something in between that their cultural world did not separate into those categories is a question that the distance of 1,000 years makes impossible to answer precisely. What is clear is that the winter had a presence in the Norse mythological imagination that was not merely threatening but also numinous. The dark months, as the time when the boundary between the human world and the world of the spirits was thinner, when the dead were closer, when the powers that normally operated at a remove from human affairs were pressing more nearly against the membrane of the everyday. The Norse legal and political calendar was organised around the thing, the assembly at which free men gathered to resolve disputes, conduct trials, declare new laws, and manage the collective governance of their communities. The thing system was one of the most remarkable legal institutions of the medieval world, and its relationship to the Norse winter is direct and specific. The major things were held in summer, when travel was possible, and when the agricultural calendar had a brief window between the end of spring work and the beginning of the hay harvest. The Althing of Iceland, founded in 930 and held at Thingvellir for 2 weeks each June, was the most sophisticated expression of the Thing tradition, a national parliament operating without a king or a professional judiciary, in which the Godar, the chieftains who were simultaneously religious and political leaders, assembled to hear cases and make decisions by the application of the law that the law speaker, the lugsugumada, the man of the law speech, recited from memory at every assembly. The law speaker's function, the memorization, and annual public recitation of the entire body of Icelandic law, which before the laws were written down in the 12th century, was the sole mechanism by which the law was preserved and made publicly available, is one of the most demanding intellectual achievements of the Norse world, and it was an achievement of the winter as much as of the summer. The preparation and maintenance of the legal memory that made the summer recitation possible happened in the winter months, in the longhouse, by firelight, through the practice and review that the indoor season permitted. The law speaker who stood at Thingvellir in June and recited the laws for 3 years had been doing that recitation in his head and testing its completeness in conversation with other legal experts through the winter months when the Althing was only a memory and a preparation. The Norse legal tradition that the Thing system embodied was sophisticated in ways that the popular image of Viking lawlessness consistently misrepresents. Norse law was detailed, systematic, and extensively concerned with the specific resolution of the specific disputes that a farming and seafaring society generated. Property rights were defined with precision. Inheritance rules were elaborate and carefully specified. The law of compensation, the Vigil system by which injuries and deaths were compensated in standardized payments rather than through unlimited blood vengeance, was the mechanism by which the Norse attempted to prevent the spiral of retaliation that unregulated feuding produced. The sagas are full of legal argument, legal procedure, and the specific consequences of legal violations, because the law was the framework within which the social conflicts that made good narrative were conducted, and because the audiences for the sagas were people who lived within that legal framework and found its operation as interesting as the fighting. The concept of hygge that modern Scandinavian culture has exported to the rest of the world as a design philosophy of warm lighting and woolen socks and hot drinks is, at its deepest level, a survival adaptation dressed as an aesthetic preference. The Norse and their descendants learned, over centuries of North Atlantic winters, that the quality of the indoor environment during the dark months was not merely a comfort consideration, but a psychological necessity, that the warmth and the light and the social closeness of the winter hearth were the mechanisms by which communities sustained the morale and the solidarity that the physical challenge of the winter required. The the Norse longhouse was not just a shelter from the cold. It was a social technology for maintaining the human connections that the cold months tested most severely. The clothing that the Norse wore through the winter months was not merely functional, but a demonstration of accumulated textile knowledge and a marker of social position whose specific forms the archaeological and textual sources have allowed us to reconstruct with considerable confidence. Understanding what the Norse wore is important because it was the outermost layer of the thermal management system that, along with the longhouse, kept them alive, and it was made entirely from materials produced within the household or obtained through local trade. Wool was the primary textile of the Norse winter wardrobe, and the specific qualities of Norse wool cloth, produced by the cold-adapted sheep breeds of Scandinavia and Iceland, were different in ways that mattered from the wool cloth of warmer climates. Cold climate sheep produce wool with a high lanolin content and a specific fibre structure that makes the resulting cloth water repellent when unwashed, a quality that modern outdoor clothing manufacturers replicate with chemical treatments, but that the Norse obtained for free from the specific biology of their animals. The vadmal, that was the standard cloth of Norse Iceland, and that served as a unit of account in the Icelandic economy, was a dense, firmly woven twill that was both warm and, in its unwashed state, moderately resistant to the rain and sleet of the North Atlantic climate. It was not waterproof in the modern sense, but it was water-resistant in the practical sense that mattered for the daily outdoor work of a Norse farmstead. The Norse layered their clothing against the cold with a sophistication that modern outdoor layering systems would recognise as essentially correct. The innermost layer, the shirt and undergarments worn against the skin, was typically of wool or, in households that could afford it, of linen, which was a luxury import in Iceland where flax could not be grown. The middle layers added insulation through the air trapped between garments and the thickness of the fabric. The outer layer, the cloak, the heavy woolen overgarment that was the Norse traveller's primary cold weather protection, was designed to shed rain and wind and to be wrapped around the body in configurations that allowed the wearer to adjust their exposure to the specific conditions of the moment. The footwear was one of the most critical elements of Norse cold weather equipment, and the archaeological record of Norse shoes and boots, preserved in waterlogged context at sites like York and Dublin, and in the Norse settlements of Iceland, shows a tradition of leather working of considerable sophistication. The specific construction of Norse shoes, with their turned seam construction and their ability to conform to the individual foot, produced footwear that was both warm and, when greased with animal fat as the Norse regularly did, reasonably water-resistant. The addition of leg wrappings, the strips of wool cloth bound around the lower leg that appear in pictorial sources and in the sagas, provided additional insulation and protection from the cold and wet that boots alone could not exclude. The hats and headgear that the Norse wore in winter are less well preserved in the archaeological record, but appear in enough contemporary depictions and in sufficient textual references to establish that they were understood as important protective equipment rather than merely decorative. The hood, the combined hat and neck covering that was the standard cold weather head protection of the Norse and much of medieval northern Europe, was typically of wool and was sometimes lined with fur for the most extreme cold. The fur-lined hood and the fur-trimmed cloak that appear in high-status Norse depictions were not merely luxury indicators, but functional improvements to the thermal system that the wealth of the wearer allowed them to afford, and that the Norse climate made genuinely useful. The sick and the elderly faced the Norse winter with a particular vulnerability that the culture acknowledged and tried to address within the constraints of what was available. The Norse had no hospitals and no professional physicians in the modern sense, but they had a well-developed tradition of medicinal knowledge carried by the women of the community, the leknar, the healers, whose knowledge combined herbal medicine, wound treatment, and what modern biomedicine would classify as psychological care into a unified practice that was probably more effective against the specific ailments of the Norse winter than is sometimes acknowledged. The chest infections and respiratory diseases that close quarters, smoke inhalation, and vitamin D deficiency in the low sun months produced were the primary medical challenge of the winter season, and the Norse herbal tradition included a range of preparations: coltsfoot for coughs, angelica for respiratory complaints, juniper for various infections, that contemporary herbalism recognises as having genuine therapeutic value. The concept of utiseta, sitting out, was a specific Norse practice whose relationship to winter survival takes several forms. In its most literal sense, it referred to the practice of sitting alone outside overnight, in the cold and darkness as a form of spiritual seeking, a context in which a practitioner, typically a vulva or a person seeking specific oracular knowledge, exposed themselves to the night and the cold and the dark as a way of opening themselves to the communications of the spirit world that the Norse cosmology located at the margins of human comfort. It was dangerous, obviously. Hypothermia was a real risk, and the fact that the practice was undertaken deliberately and with specific spiritual purpose tells you something about the Norse willingness to engage with the winter's dangers directly, rather than simply trying to minimise exposure to them. The vulva deserves more than a passing mention, because she, and it was typically a she, represents one of the most striking figures in Norse religious and social life, and her role was particularly associated with the winter months when the boundary between worlds was understood to be most permeable. The vulva was a travelling seeress, a practitioner of cedar, a form of Norse shamanic magic involving trance states, spirit communication, and the ability to see and sometimes manipulate the threads of fate, who moved between Norse communities, typically in winter when travel was otherwise minimal, offering her services to households that wanted to know their future or needed specific spiritual interventions. The account of a vulva's visit in the saga of Eric the Red, set in Greenland in the early 11th century, describes her arrival at a Norse farmstead in winter, with a detail and a specificity that suggests the account is drawing on real practice. Her elaborate equipment and clothing, the specific preparations the household made for the séance, the communal singing that induced her trance, the specific questions she answered about the coming year's harvest, and the fate of the community. The physical landscape of winter was not only a threat to be survived, but also, in the Norse understanding, a resource to be used. And no one understood the winter landscape of the far north as a resource more completely than the Sami, the indigenous people of northern Scandinavia whose presence in the Norse world has been consistently under-acknowledged in the popular narrative of the Viking Age. The Sami were not a single unified people, but a collection of communities spread across the northern reaches of Norway, Sweden, Finland, and the Kola Peninsula of Russia, speaking related languages in the Finno-Ugric family entirely unrelated to the Norse languages, practicing an economy based on reindeer herding, hunting and fishing that was adapted to the subarctic environment with a specificity and a sophistication that the Norse settlers who moved into the same territory never quite matched. The Norse knew the Sami as Finnar. The term appears repeatedly in the sagas and in the earlier Norse sources, and their relationship with them was complex, ranging from the commercial exchange that both parties found mutually beneficial to the tax collection that the Norse imposed on Sami communities in the territories they controlled, to the cultural borrowing that ran primarily from Sami to Norse, rather than in the other direction, to occasional violence and raiding that characterised the relationship between neighbouring peoples of different cultural and economic orientations across the medieval period. What the Sami knew about northern winter survival was considerably more than the Norse knew when they arrived, and the evidence of the Norse sources suggests that the exchange of knowledge was real and significant. The skis that are central to the Norse winter mobility tradition appear in the Norse archaeological and written record earlier in the northern regions, where contact with Sami communities was most intensive, suggesting that the technology, which the Sami had been using for thousands of years before the Norse arrived, was transferred to the Norse population through exactly the kind of cultural contact that the sagas sometimes describe and sometimes simply assume. The specific techniques of reindeer herding that some Norse populations adopted in the northern regions, the use of reindeer as draft animals in ways that the Norse agricultural tradition had not previously employed, the knowledge of the high mountain winter environments that the Norse needed to utilise the summer pastures on the high fells. All of these show the fingerprints of Sami knowledge transferred to Norse practice through the long and complicated relationship between the two peoples. The Norse mythology's relationship to the Finnar, as the Norse called the Sami, was characterised by a combination of respect and unease that suggests the cultural exchange was real enough to generate admiration for Sami knowledge, while the difference between Norse and Sami practices remained visible and significant. The Norse associated the Finnar with powerful magic, with specific kinds of weather manipulation and shamanistic knowledge that the Norse cedar tradition shared features with, and this association was neither pure invention nor pure mythology, but reflected real observation of Sami shamanic practice. The Noaidi, the Sami shaman, whose practices of drum-mediated trance and spirit communication were closely related to the kind of Seder that the Norse Völva practiced, suggesting either parallel development or, more likely, some degree of cultural transmission between the two traditions. The snow that covered the ground for months was not merely an obstacle to movement, but a medium for transportation. The Norse use of skis, documented from the early Norse period and continuing in Scandinavian culture without interruption to the present day, allowed movement across snow-covered terrain at speeds and with an efficiency that was impossible with any other technology available to the period. The Sami people, the indigenous inhabitants of the far north of Scandinavia who interacted continuously with the Norse settlers, and whose relationship with the Norse ranged from productive exchange to mutual raiding and accommodation, were the Norse world's most accomplished users of snow terrain technologies, and the exchange of knowledge between Sami and Norse communities about winter survival was one of the more productive cross-cultural exchanges of the Viking Age, though it is less often acknowledged than the more dramatic Norse-Irish or Norse-English interactions of the same period. The ice that formed on the fjords and the inland lakes in the depth of winter was similarly a resource as well as an obstacle. Frozen waterways provided road surfaces that the summer landscape of rock and bog and tangled forest could not match, allowing the movement of sledges and the transport of heavy loads across terrain that was otherwise impassable. The Norse ice culture, ice fishing through holes cut in the frozen surfaces of lakes and fjords, ice roads maintained as community resources, the specific knowledge of ice quality that allowed people to know whether a given frozen surface was safe for human weight or for loaded sledges, was another body of practical knowledge that the winter required and the community maintained. The Norse settlement of Iceland, which began around 870 CE and was substantially complete by 930, represents one of the most remarkable voluntary colonizations of an inhospitable environment in human history, and the winter survival knowledge it required was different in specific ways from the Norwegian knowledge that the settlers brought with them, different because Iceland was different from Norway in ways that only became fully apparent after settlement had begun. The most immediately relevant difference was the trees. Iceland had been partially forested when the Norse arrived. Birch woodland covered perhaps a quarter of the island, but the combination of Norse agriculture and the grazing of the sheep and cattle that the settlers brought with them destroyed this woodland with a speed that surprised even the settlers themselves, who watched the forest recede into the interior over the course of their own lifetimes. Within a few generations of settlement, the accessible woodland that the settlers had depended on for construction timber, for fuel, and for the 100 other uses that a timber-rich culture made of its forest was essentially gone from most of Iceland. The settlers adapted. They shifted to peat and dried sheep dung as primary fuel sources, to turf as the primary building material, to driftwood and imported timber for the specific construction applications that required it. The Icelandic longhouse built of turf was, as we have noted, an engineering achievement that compensated for the loss of timber insulation with the natural insulating properties of sod, and it proved in practice to be an effective winter shelter. The ruins that archaeologists have excavated across Iceland show the specific features of the turf-building tradition being refined over generations into increasingly efficient forms. The volcanic landscape of Iceland provided one resource that Norway did not: geothermal heat, The hot springs and steam vents that dot the Icelandic landscape are the surface expression of the volcanic system beneath the island, and the Norse settlers used them with a practicality that was entirely characteristic of their approach to natural resources in general. Geothermal areas provided washing and bathing facilities that remained usable through the winter when surface water froze. They provided the specific temperature environments that certain food preservation processes required. The warm ground around hot springs was used for the burial of certain fermented foods. They provided a warmth and a light at the edges of the winter darkness, the steam rising from the hot springs visible against the night sky, the warmth of the geothermal ground perceptible underfoot even in the deepest cold. That was a genuine psychological as well as practical resource. The Greenlandic settlements, two separate colonies established around 985 CE by Eric the Red and his followers, the eastern settlement near modern Qaqortoq and the western settlement near modern Nuuk, pushed the limits of Norse winter survival further than any other part of the Norse world, and they are the subject of more historical argument than almost any other aspect of the Viking Age, partly because they failed eventually, and partly because the manner of their failure illuminates what the Norse winter survival system required and what happened when those requirements could not be met. At their peak, around 1100 to 1300 CE, the Greenlandic settlements supported a population of perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 people, organised into farms that were smaller and more vulnerable than those of Iceland or Norway, dependent on a pastoral economy of cattle, sheep, and goats that required careful management of very limited hay-growing land, and supplemented by hunting of seal and caribou and the occasional walrus, whose ivory was one of the Greenlandic settlers' primary trade commodities with the wider Norse world. The walrus was central to the Greenlandic economy in ways that the settlement's survival depended on. The ivory from walrus tusks, lighter and more plentiful than elephant ivory, and available in the quantities that the large walrus populations of Greenlandic waters provided, was the commodity that the Greenlandic settlers traded to Norway and Europe in exchange for the timber, iron, grain and manufactured goods that they could not produce locally. When the European market for walrus ivory collapsed in the 13th century, replaced by elephant ivory from Africa, that the expansion of Italian and Portuguese trade in the Mediterranean and Atlantic was making available at lower prices, the economic basis of the Greenlandic settlements deteriorated sharply. The settlers who had survived winters that would have defeated most of the populations of medieval Europe found that the economic system that connected them to the wider Norse world, and that provided the margin of trade goods whose absence made the already difficult survival calculus impossible, was withdrawing from them. The western settlement was abandoned sometime in the mid-14th century. The eastern settlement lingered into the 15th century before disappearing from the records. What exactly happened at the end, whether the settlers died in place, emigrated to Iceland or Norway, were absorbed by the Inuit populations who were contemporaneously expanding into the same territory, or some combination of all three, is not definitively established by the evidence, and continues to be discussed by the archaeologists and historians working on the Greenlandic Norse. What the archaeology of the final phases shows clearly is a population under severe stress, eating the foods of last resort, the bones of dogs and horses in the middens of the late period, animals that the Norse in better times had not eaten, maintaining their cattle in conditions that the bone evidence suggests were those of extreme scarcity, and trying, in the end without success, to sustain a way of life that the changing climate and the changing economics of the wider world had made no longer viable. The Norse relationship to death was one of the areas where the winter landscape and the spiritual world pressed most closely together, and the management of death in the winter months was a specific challenge that Norse culture addressed with rituals and practices that reveal much about how the community understood the boundary between the living and the dead. Death in winter was common, and not only of the very old or the very sick. The combination of cold exposure, food scarcity in the late winter months, respiratory disease worsened by smoke-filled interiors, and the accidents that the darkness and the ice produced meant that the Norse longhouse community could expect to lose members in the winter months with a regularity that the modern world, with its central heating and its hospitals and its readily available food, does not experience. The treatment of the dead in winter, the burial practices, the funeral rituals, the specific ways in which the community managed the transition of a person from the living world to the dead, was shaped by the practical conditions of the season in ways that the literary sources do not always explicitly describe but that the archaeological evidence illuminates. Ground burial in the depths of a Norwegian or Icelandic winter was difficult or impossible in regions where the soil froze solid. The Norse response to this practical constraint varied by region and by period. In some areas, bodies were stored through the winter in outbuildings or in natural cold storage. The same cold that preserved the autumn slaughter's meat was cold enough to preserve a human body until the ground thawed and buried in spring. In other areas and periods, ship burials or mound burials were prepared in autumn before the freeze, allowing interment during the period when the ground was still workable. The elaborate ship burials of the Norse aristocracy, Gokstad, Oseberg, Tun, the great mound burials of Norway and Sweden that have produced the most spectacular archaeological finds of the Viking Age, were not typically winter burials, but they were planned for and prepared against the certainty of death that every Norse community lived with year-round. The Draugr, the Norse undead, the restless dead who could not lie quietly in their mounds but walked in the winter nights threatening the living, were a specific Norse supernatural category whose association with the winter is not coincidental. The Draugr was particularly active in the long dark months, when the nights were longest, and the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was most permeable. The sagas that describe encounters with Draugr, the famous cases in Eyrbyggja saga and Grettis saga, where specific named dead men leave their burial mounds and create havoc in their former communities, are set in winter, and the quality of the encounters described, the Draugr's supernatural strength, the smell of the grave that accompanied it, the cold that it carried, maps onto the specific sensory qualities of a Norse winter night in ways that make the mythology and the season inseparable. The Norse practice of offering food and drink at burial mounds was understood partly as provision for the dead on their journey, but also as a means of maintaining a relationship with the dead that was actively productive for the living. The ancestors in their mounds were potential sources of advice, of warning, of the specific practical knowledge that the living needed, and that only those who had lived through many years and many winters had accumulated. The vulva who communicated with the dead was doing something that the Norse world did not understand as fundamentally different from the communication with the living that the winter evenings around the fire conducted. Both were ways of accessing knowledge that the community needed, and that not every community member possessed. The Norse mythological understanding of winter and of time was itself shaped by the experience of the long dark season, and the cosmology that the Eddas preserve reflects the specific psychological texture of a people, whose year was divided between the productive warmth of summer and the existential challenge of winter, in ways that have no close parallel in the mythologies of more temperate peoples. The Norse cosmos was not an eternal, stable divine order, but a dynamic, contested, ultimately doomed arrangement. The gods themselves were not immortal, but sustained by the apples of Idun, subject to aging without them, and the entire cosmic order would end at Ragnarök, the twilight of the gods, in a cataclysm that the seers of the Völuspá describe with specific physical imagery that matched the most extreme experiences of the Norse winter at its most violent. The Fimbul winter, Fimbulvera, the great winter that was prophesied as the precursor to Ragnarök. 3 winters with no summer between them, snow driving from every direction, the bonds of kinship and community dissolving in the face of extreme privation, was not an abstract theological concept, but a specific and recognizable description of what the Norse knew, from experience and from the stories of hard years, that extreme cold could do to human communities. The gods themselves were engaged in the same struggle for survival that their worshippers were. Odin was not a serene, omniscient deity residing in distant perfection. He was a figure of relentless, anxious activity, gathering knowledge, recruiting the warriors who would fight at his side at Ragnarok, sacrificing his eye at the well of Mimir for wisdom, hanging himself on the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 nights to learn the runes, driven by the knowledge that the doom of the gods was coming and that no degree of preparation could prevent it, only perhaps delay it and ensure that the best possible resistance would be offered when it arrived. There is something in this theology that is deeply continuous with the Norse relationship to the winter, the knowledge that the dark and the cold will come regardless of preparation, that the most you can do is prepare as well as possible and maintain the social bonds that survival requires, and face what comes with the equanimity that the Norse called drengskap, the quality of the good man that combined courage and decency, and the willingness to keep going in full knowledge of the difficulty ahead. The concept of time in the Norse world was not linear in the Judeo-Christian sense, not a sequence of unique events moving from creation toward judgment, but cyclical in ways that the agricultural year modelled and the cosmological narrative reinforced. The sun came back after the solstice. The animals survived the winter. The grass grew in the spring. The hay was cut. The animals went to the summer pastures. The hay was cut again. The animals came home again. The winter came again. This cycle was not mere repetition. Each turn of the wheel was specific, shaped by the specific weather and the specific decisions of the specific people living through it. But the framework within which each specific event occurred was the cycle itself, and the Norse relationship to time was one in which the return of the familiar was not monotony but reassurance, the confirmation that the world was still doing what the world was supposed to do. The specific Norse word for this cyclical return, the word they used for the year itself in its sense of the agricultural cycle, RR, carried the double meaning of year and of good harvest, of the passage of time and of the abundance that the time, properly used, produced. A good R was both a good year and a good harvest, and the prayer for a good R that was made at the Yule feast was simultaneously a petition for the passage of time to continue and for the conditions that made that passage of time worth surviving to be favourable. The two meanings were inseparable because the experience they described was inseparable. Time and harvest, cycle and abundance, winter survived and summer returned. The memory of what the Norse winter survival required has been preserved in the landscape of modern Scandinavia and the North Atlantic islands in ways that the surface of contemporary life covers but does not entirely conceal. But there is one site that deserves special attention because it takes the Norse winter survival story to its absolute geographic limit and illuminates, by that extremity, everything that the Norse had been building toward across 5 centuries of cold weather living. Ladsor Meadows, on the northern tip of the island of Newfoundland in what is now Canada, is the only confirmed Norse site in the Americas, and its significance for the winter survival story is this. It represents the furthest extension of the Norse expansion across the North Atlantic, the point at which the chain of island hopping that had taken the Norse from Norway to Shetland to Orkney, to the Faroes, to Iceland, to Greenland, to Baffin Island, to Labrador, reached a landmass that had no further island stepping stone to the west. It was discovered archaeologically by the Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his wife, the archaeologist Anne Stine Ingstad in 1960, and the excavations they conducted through the 1960s, revealing the clearly Norse-style longhouses, the iron smelting site, the artefacts that placed the occupation firmly in the Norse tradition, confirmed what the Vinland sagas had been claiming for centuries, that the Norse had reached North America around the year 1000, almost 500 years before Columbus. The Norse who spent time at Ladsor Meadows, and the evidence suggests that it was a relatively brief occupation, perhaps a decade or two at most, serving primarily as a base camp for exploration further south, rather than as a permanent settlement, brought with them the full toolkit of Norse winter survival that the preceding centuries of North Atlantic experience had developed. The 3 longhouses excavated at the site with their turf walls and their central hearths are recognisably Norse in their design, and in the way they addressed the specific problems of the North American subarctic winter. The iron smelting evidence suggests that the Norse at Lonso Meadows were processing the bog iron ore available in the area, maintaining the metalworking capability that their material culture required, rather than depending entirely on imported iron tools. The butternuts found at the site, a species that does not grow as far north as Newfoundland but is native to the St. Lawrence Valley further south, suggest that the Norse were ranging considerably south of Lonso Meadows and bringing back the botanical and economic resources they found there. The winter that the Norse at Lonso Meadows experienced would have been different from Norwegian or Icelandic winters in specific ways. The latitude was lower, the cold somewhat less extreme, the winter darkness shorter, but it was still a North American winter at 51 degrees north, with temperatures well below freezing, with snow and ice, with the specific demands that any North Atlantic winter placed on a small community of people trying to survive on stored provisions in a landscape that was in many respects less familiar and less predictable than any winter they had experienced before. They managed it with the same tools and the same knowledge and the same social organisation that they had brought from Norway and Iceland, the same longhouse architecture, the same provision storage, the same textile practices, the same social bonds organised around the winter fire, and the evidence suggests that they managed it successfully for the duration of their stay. Why they left is not definitively established by the evidence. The Vinland sagas that describe the Norse exploration of North America suggest conflicts with the indigenous peoples. The Skrællingar, the Norse term for the various North American indigenous populations they encountered, that eventually made the Norse position untenable. The numbers the Norse could practically bring across the North Atlantic to any single site were small, and the indigenous populations they were encountering were not the thinly spread communities of Iceland or the uninhabited Greenlandic coasts, but the residents of a continent whose population was vastly larger than anything the Norse had encountered in the North Atlantic. The decision to withdraw was probably pragmatic rather than forced. The Norse at their best were strategic enough to recognise when a situation required retreat, and the situation at the edge of the American continent, surrounded by peoples they could not communicate with, and outnumbered in any conflict they might face, was a situation that the knowledge they had built across 5 centuries of cold weather expansion was not sufficient to change, and the North Atlantic islands in ways that the surface of contemporary life covers but does not entirely conceal. The turf longhouses of Iceland, excavated and studied by archaeologists at dozens of sites across the island, show the evolution of the building tradition over centuries with a specificity that allows the reconstruction of entire farmsteads and the lives lived in them. The Strong farmstead in the Þjórsárvötn Valley, buried under the ash of the Mount Hekla eruption of 1104 and excavated in the 20th century, is the most completely preserved Norse farmstead in Iceland, its walls and rooms and the layouts of its daily life preserved under the volcanic layer, in a condition that made it possible to build an accurate full-scale reconstruction nearby at Tjodveldisbærin, the Commonwealth Farm, where visitors can walk through the turf-walled interior and stand by the central hearth space and understand in a physical way the dimensions of the world that the Norse winter contained. The Shetland and Orkney Island farmsteads that the Norse settled from the early 9th century onward, the Jarlshof site at the southern tip of Shetland, occupied continuously from the Bronze Age through the Viking period and beyond, shows the layers of occupation with a clarity that makes it one of the most remarkable archaeological sites in the British Isles. The Norse farmsteads at Jarlshof were built in the same tradition as their Norwegian originals, modified by the specific conditions of the Shetland environment, the extreme wind exposure, the limited timber, the rich marine resources, in ways that show the adaptability of the Norse building tradition to the specific demands of each new environment it encountered. The food traditions that Norse winter survival produced have also left traces in the culinary cultures of modern Scandinavia that are more direct and less transformed by the intervening millennium than might be expected. The fermented dairy products, skyr in Iceland, which has had a global commercial success as a health food in recent decades and is produced today by industrial processors in factories across the world, but whose recipe and its relationship to the land and the cattle and the preservation requirements of the Icelandic winter are the same in essence as they were 1,000 years ago. The dried fish of Norway, the stockfish whose production on the coastal racks is still a visible feature of the Norwegian winter landscape in the Lofoten Islands and elsewhere, the fish that sustained not only the Norse, but half of medieval Catholic Europe on its Fridays and its fasting days, is still produced by the same air-drying process that the Viking Age fishermen used, still driven by the same coastal wind, still valued in the same Italian markets that were its primary export destination in the medieval period. The skiing tradition that has made Scandinavian nations so consistently dominant in the Winter Olympics is not a modern sport invented to fill the long winters with athletic activity. It is the direct continuation, through an unbroken cultural tradition, of a practical technology that the Norse developed for winter travel, and that the populations of Norway, Sweden and Finland maintained as the central motor skill of winter life across centuries of continuous use. The ski jumper and the cross-country skier and the alpine racer are all, in their different ways, displaying the embodied knowledge of the Norse winter survival tradition, the intuitive understanding of snow surfaces and gradients, and the physics of sliding on cold water that the Norse farmers and hunters and warriors developed over generations of necessity, and that their descendants have maintained and elaborated and turned into a global sport culture. But that began, most fundamentally, in the problem of how to move through a landscape that was covered in snow for half the year. The Norse winter survival story is not ultimately a story about hardship, though hardship is genuinely part of it. It is a story about a civilization that engaged honestly with the conditions of its existence, that looked at the latitude it inhabited, and the climate it faced, and the resources it had available and built through centuries of careful practical learning, a set of material and social and spiritual technologies that allowed it not merely to survive but to flourish in ways whose cultural products have proven among the most durable in the history of the northern world. The longships that crossed the North Atlantic and the legal assemblies that governed Iceland and the poetry that preserved the mythology of the Norse gods and the democratic governance of the Thing, all of these were possible because of the winter, because of the long nights that gave the schools their audience and the craftsmen their time and the community its social intensity, because of the cold that demanded the organisation of collective effort and the sharing of warmth and the mutual dependence that the worst of the dark months required, because of the specific quality of attention that survival demands of people who cannot be casual about what is trying to kill them. The firelight that animated the longhouse interior through the winter nights was not only heat and light, it was the context in which the Norse world was constituted and maintained, in which the stories were told and the songs were sung and the children were taught, and the dead were remembered and the gods were invoked, and the plans were made and the community was held together against the long press of the dark. The fire was the centre around which everything else organised itself, and the people who sat around it were doing something more fundamental and more important than simply staying warm. They were doing what human beings have always done in the face of what is difficult and dark and cold. They were finding each other, and in finding each other, finding the reasons to continue. That is worth holding in your mind tonight, as the light in your own room is something softer than a longhouse fire, and the temperature outside is probably not life-threatening, and the winter you are facing, whatever its specific character, is very likely less demanding than the ones we have been discussing. The fundamental human activity of the Norse longhouse, sitting near the warmth, listening to a story, waiting for the darkness to lift, is continuous with what you are doing right now. The darkness comes, you make light. The cold comes, you make warmth. The story comes, you listen. These are very old things. They are, in some deep sense, the same things. Across the 1,000 years and the 1,000 miles that separate you from the Norse farmer, sitting by the longhouse fire, while the North Atlantic winter pressed its weight against the turf walls, and the cattle, shifted in their stalls at the lower end of the building, and the spindle turned and the story continued and the night went on. Let that settle around you now. The fire is low, but it is there. The walls are holding. The dark outside has weight, but the inside has warmth. The skald has found the beginning of the next story. Outside, the wind in the roof sounds like something coming, but inside, by the fire, there is a quality of light and closeness that the cold cannot quite reach. Rest easy.